Welcome to the webinar of the Royal Society of Medicine. And today we're very, very happy to welcome Jeremy Farrar as our guest. Jeremy, so maybe you would like to say a few words to introduce yourself, and then we're going to kick in the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. I'm Jeremy Farrar. I work at Wellcome Trust. My background's in infectious diseases and global health.
And hi, my name is Joanne, and I'm a PDR, and I'm a former international president of Médecins, Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. So Jeremy, so great to see you. It's been a long time. So I think all of us are keen to find out, what is your reading of the current situation? We know that right now, UK has been a leading country in easing down the public health measure, although we have soaring cases of COVID-19 right now. And then the fact that there's an average of 534 deaths per day, which is about, every 3 minutes, a UK person is dying. So if you were still on the stage, on the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergency, would you have advised your current, Prime Minister to ease the public health measure like you're doing right now and learn to live with COVID-19?
Thanks, Joanne. And it's great to see you. Sorry, we haven't caught up for ages. Always enjoyed agreeing and more commonly disagreeing with some of the things we debate. So this is a very terrifying experience. I've said for a long time, I think going into a pandemic is tough. Being in the middle of a pandemic is incredibly difficult and hard and on everybody across all walks of life. This idea that you exit a pandemic, though, I think is not true. I just don't think you wake up one Tuesday and it's finished. It's not going to happen like that. And the transition from sort of acute phase of the pandemic to something new, yet not yet defined, is really difficult, bumpy. It's different around the world, different within a single country, with the degree of inequity that's happened globally, but also nationally. So I think this transition phase is going to be really very, very difficult. And there will be some that argue it's all behind us, it's finished, you probably exaggerated it in the middle anyway, and we just want to move on and forget it. And then there's other people that think we're still in the midst of it, and so the tension, I think, within societies are going to be very difficult to handle. In the UK at the moment, just to sort of, I don't wish to correct the person interviewing me, especially when it's you, Joanne, but the data of 500 is shocking yesterday, but we should just remind ourselves that it is on a Tuesday when there is a catch up. If you look at the tragedy, and I don't want to sound too clinical about this, but if you look at the date of death, then the 7-day average is still incredibly high, but it is about around between 200 and 300 people every day. The 500 is a reflection of reporting times and dates. So I do want to just make that point. I was in favor, I have been in favor, I'm no longer on stage, of starting to lift restrictions, yes. But I would be in favor of continuing, for instance, mask wearing on public transport, in enclosed spaces, etc. And I would be pushing ever harder on trying to encourage people to be vaccinated, get their boosting doses, and make sure that everybody has access to the vaccines from a UK perspective. And of course, we can talk globally in a second. So I would have been a little bit more cautious. I would have started lift restrictions, yes, but I would have kept, for instance, mask wearing in public transport and indoors places.
Right, thank you very much. And so, so looking back a little bit, because there's been some recent study was just published talking about one of the main, we say, asset in terms of a successful response. And then we know that UK has not fared maybe as well as what we thought, knowing how they have ranked in the Global Health Security Index as one of the top countries to be prepared. But do you think that the trust of the population towards this government was as well a key thing to make the performance of UK not as good as it should have been? Or is there something else that we need to figure it out?
Yeah, I think those evaluations that were done in the pre-COVID era were were done with the best intentions. They were done, but they were done very much through a lens of a medical, biomedical lens. In other words, was there a, for instance, in the UK perspective, was there a health system that provided for all citizens in the main and free at the point of delivery? In other words, the National Health Service, and was there deemed to be sufficient capacity? So the lens that those evaluations did, which the UK did come out very strongly in, I think very much underestimated other harder to measure but critically important issues. Trust. The report that you mentioned that puts trust as one of the key features that has seemed to be important in this COVID. We knew that, as you know very well, during the Ebola crisis of 2014. We've known that in every epidemic. We've known that community trust and community ownership of what is being done with them, for them, by them, etc., is absolutely critical. But so is an understanding of social behavior. That doesn't feature. It's hard to quantify. It's hard to include. It's much easier to count the number of beds in a hospital. And I think when we start to think of our resilience in the future, we've got to think much more holistically of the whole system rather than just seeing it through a biomedical lens. And that does include trust. It includes government decision making. It includes the ability to take on advice and use it in the best way possible. And these are all features, inequality within our societies before a pandemic. And I think if you look at the UK and the US, for instance, who did very strongly in those pre-assessments, issues of social determinants of health, inequality across our societies, mistrust in government or authorities, these have become really painful lessons during COVID.
Right, absolutely. And I think that we're still going to be learning. So looking at what's going on right now, how do you see, the world moving into this phase? And do you think that we're going to lift the public health emergency of international concern this year? And what would be your advice to the WHO?
I think that the sort of human nature and certainly political nature will be to particularly in countries like the UK with high vaccine uptake, will to say we've got to move on. We've got to, this thing called learn to live with it. We've got to get back to normal. And I have a lot of sympathy with the disruption of education, the disruption of opportunity, the health and the economic and all of the impacts. We've got to, my concern is that there will be too fast a shift to saying it's all over. And we will lose the humility of accepting that we're only 2 years into a novel human pathogen that is still a huge amount of uncertainty. And whilst we may base policy decisions on the most likely scenario, which is of transition into this thing called endemic, Omicron is now obviously dominant, but it is clearly less severe, particularly in those people that have been vaccinated or are immune. And is this a transition to endemicity? That is, I think, the most likely scenario. And I can't quantify this, but I would guess that has a sort of 40 or 50% chance of being true. The trouble is there are some other scenarios. And my worry in the push to try and move on from this, we ignore those other scenarios, which are less rosy, but we should be absolutely prepared for. And then the second thing on an international agenda, the situation in the UK, and I don't know about in Canada, but in the UK, that is not replicated around the world. Vaccine inequity remains a horrific stain on all of us. We have 90% people getting vaccinated in some countries with a booster dose, or even some places a fourth dose. And yet there are many countries that have only got less than 10% of their first dose. That is difficult to accept. It's impossible to accept. We should not accept it. And I think until we resolve those sorts of issues, then we're all at risk. My worry is we're going to try and move on too quickly. Right.
Thank you very much. And so you talk about vaccine equity, and this is a really, really, I would say, dear subject to me. And I've been advocating for that. But one of the things that we are slowly to realize is the fact that it's going to be a lot of leg work, because it's not because we are sending free vaccine to low-income country that people are going to line up and wait to get a jab in their arms. So what do you foresee as the best way to support that? And what do you think would be the role of Wellcome Trust in supporting this vaccination rollout?
Yeah, so Wellcome, and very different, as you know, to your time at MSF. Well, we are a research-based, science-based organization. We're not an agency that is actually administering vaccines, but I think increasingly those divisions are almost false, because as what's happened with vaccine equity, we wouldn't be the right people though to do the job of UNICEF or MSF or of Gavi or the Global Fund. There are much better people, national governments, to do that than we can do. I think what we can do is ensure that the science is done, the interventions, whether non-pharmacological or pharmacological vaccines, drugs, etc., are structured in a way that ensures that we do break down this inequity. I think there's two elements to it. One is the short term, and that's now. How can we have the manufacturing done at the scale and speed that's required, the logistics? How can we build trust in communities that these are vaccines that communities want, not are being imposed upon them? How can we ensure that those vaccines are not just available in London and urban areas in UK or Canada or DRC or wherever, but actually reach the last mile in rural communities as much as in city centres? And then what do we do in the medium term? What do we do in the long term that means this would never happen again, and goes beyond epidemics, that addresses the issues that came up during the start of the HIV crisis, or have come up more recently in other areas, and including and been amplified during COVID. I think that requires a rethinking of access to the tools that are required. It requires a rethinking of where we have manufacturing, who owns that manufacturing, where it's based, which countries, in which regions, and how we make sure that there is greater access, not just to vaccines for COVID, but other critical health and other interventions. Right.
And so while you're talking a bit, about, how we're going to come together to do that, what is your reading? Because this is astonishing that knowing, I would say, the impact of COVID-19 on people's life across the globe, we still did not manage to come together. When you look at the different multilateral platform that we have, like the United Nations General Assembly, we could not come up with a political declaration about how to basically do better, invest on preparedness and storage capacity. And they basically passed the buck, Canadian playing hockey, to the World Health Assembly in November. And then basically they come out and say, oh guys, we're going to do a pandemic treaty and we're going to deliver it in 2024. How optimistic are you that this pandemic treaty will enable us to be better prepared and answer better next time around?
So I think this is, COVID is a big enough issue, but if we don't address this issue, which I call the geopolitics, I've previously talked about the 4 circles of COVID, and just to very quickly go through them. The first circle is the direct health consequences of COVID, getting sick, going to hospital. The second circle is the disruption of all of the rest of healthcare, cancer care, TB care, maternal child health, mental health. The second circle. The third circle is the disruption of economics, opportunities for education, trade, remittances, debt, the broader societal impacts. And the fourth circle, which I think is in some ways the hardest, and which has made this pandemic worse, and which has really profound implications for the future, is the geopolitics. This pandemic has been made worse, in my view, by a catastrophic failure of global diplomacy. I think it bedeviled the start of the pandemic, frankly, and very happy to talk about my views of the origins of the virus and what happened in the early days of December 2019 and January 2020. But there's no doubt in my mind that the geopolitics of 2020 made this pandemic far worse than it needed to be. and the ongoing geopolitics of East-West, but increasingly, understandably, North-South, because of vaccine inequity, is going to lead to really troubling years ahead, and will have ramifications beyond pandemics to our ability to come together to solve issues of inequality, of issues of climate change, of issues of drug resistance, of issues of migration and conflict. And I think, as we did at various times in the 20th century, unless we use a crisis to ask some fundamental questions of how we're going to work across borders with each other, even when we disagree with each other, I'm not very optimistic that we will, without major reforms, be able to do that. And I think that will leave a legacy of COVID that will trouble future generations if we don't grasp that nettle now. Because those systems you're talking about, World Bank, IMF, United Nations, WHO, G7, G20, etc., are now so riven by divisions internally within them, they're finding it very difficult to coalesce and convene around things. And I think that is very troubling.
Yes, I share your concern, your deep concern as well. Listen, we have question in the Q&A, and this question that you just alluded to it about, what are the origin of this virus? And someone is asking again, could it be a leak from a lab? I know you answered this question on several of your interviews. Maybe you've changed or tweaking your answer. Can you share with us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can. And so the way I frame it is that I believe, in my view, of the scientific evidence that's available and has been available since January 2020, that the overwhelming probability is that this is a natural event, that is an animal virus that came across to humans, probably not once, but maybe on multiple occasions over many, many years, and that it then, through evolution, acquired the ability to become a human pathogen, and then was amplified in Wuhan in December and January of 2020, and then spread around the world. And we should note that it is continuing to evolve. Even Omicron, which has only been known about since the 24th of November, is already splitting into different subvariants of Omicron. So this is a very plastic virus, which is still evolving and will continue to evolve. I cannot, and nor can anybody else, absolutely rule out a laboratory accident. But I think the overwhelming evidence is of a zoonotic infection, an animal infection that came across to humans, which would put it on the same group as HIV, as Ebola, as Zika, as MERS, as influenza, indeed. And my concern here is, firstly, I think the way this was handled geopolitically, with throwing blame around, and as we actually repeated in South Africa, when South Africa reported the Omicron variant, we blamed South African scientists for this, even though actually they did the world a great service. We have a tendency to blame, and I think that blame in January and February and March of 2020 led to a stopping of all international cooperation to try and identify the origins of this, the animal reservoir and stuff. And as a result, I think we are now very, very vulnerable to further events, further animal viruses coming across, because we have no international cooperation going on in terms of identifying animal viruses that would be a threat to humanity. So I believe that the overwhelming majority evidence is for an animal virus. I cannot completely exclude a lab accident, and we cannot. I would just ask the world community comes together and sees that nature is the most powerful evolutionary force of all. If we now focus only on the lab side of this and we ignore the natural side, then we will miss the big driving forces of new emergence, of new pathogens, which could be so disruptive to humanity. And we must also ensure that labs are transparent, they're safe, and that the right controls and regulations are both in place but also adhered to. But the overwhelming risk here, I believe, is from natural events, as we've demonstrated time and time again over the last 50 to 60 years. And without international cooperation on this, which has stopped, we may never know, and it will take years. It took years for HIV to be understood where it came from. It took many, many years for SARS-1. It took many years for MERS. This requires deep international cooperation. And I believe we shut that door in January and February of 2020. And as a result, I'm afraid we're at greater risk today than we've had been probably throughout my professional career.
Right. Yes, I think it's going to be an unsolved enigma for a little while. So tell me, like last year, same time, January 2021, what would have been your key, I would say, lesson learned then? And then 1 year down the road now, what is your key lesson learned over the last 12 months?
I think January 2021, the key lesson for me would be firstly, what you have before a pandemic really determines your ability to respond to it, whether that's trust, health capacity, inequalities in your system, tools available like diagnostic tests, drugs, vaccines, and the systems you have in place, health systems, political systems, because you can't invent these fast enough in such a fast-moving pandemic. The second of 2020 into 21 would be, and here I would talk about the UK predominantly, but March of 2020 and the first wave in the UK was a very, very painful experience. Many people lost their lives. The data in the UK was awful. We didn't know what was happening. It was really blind to what was happening. We didn't learn enough lessons. We didn't have the humility to learn from, yes, China or Northern Italy, or indeed France and other countries. And we should have learned those lessons and acted earlier. But if I was being charitable, I would say that it was brand new. We were sort of blind to what was happening. Never faced something like this before. And there's some degree of humility to say, everyone did what they could. I'm much less charitable about what happened in the autumn, the fall of 2020, when we had brilliant data in the UK, but we failed to act early in order to reduce transmission and prevent the horrific wave of January and February 2021, when 50 or 60% of the deaths that occurred at that time occurred in that 6-week period in January. So I'm afraid we did not learn lessons. We did not learn that acting earlier means you can avoid further worse draconian measures. And we could have saved, I believe, a lot of lives in January and February of 2021. And we had a vaccine coming. We knew that by the fall of 2020 that the vaccine was going to be coming to the UK. And we only had to buy ourselves a few more months with some restrictions, and we could have reduced transmission, saved lives, and then the vaccine would have started to kick in as it did in February, March, and April of 2021. Looking now at 22, the two things that fall out for me is the vaccine inequity, that actually countries have looked after themselves and have not paid sufficient attention to global responsibilities. I think that is, of course, a moral and ethical failure, but it's actually a scientific and public health failure, because actually if we allow transmission and no vaccines to go on for much longer, we are going to face more variants. We are going to face the haunting spectre of a variant that escapes immunity if we allow high transmission, lots of virus, and highly variable immunity around the world. So the lesson for me in February 2022 is this is not yet over. I don't know if we're in the middle or towards the end of this pandemic, and it's in our hands now. We have the tools to make a massive difference on this pandemic. And the question is whether we're willing to use those in an equitable way around the world.
Right, thank you very much. There's a lot of questions in the chat room, and then I'm going to go through a few of them. And then some people know your background in immunology, and they would like to know, should we do more tests on immunity, the collective immunity of UK people, to figure out if we're going to give a 4th dose or not, or if we should give doses to our children. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the question of immunity is critical, both natural immunity through having been infected against various variants, also immunity that is generated from vaccination and across different demographics. My immunity may be quite different to the immunity of a 5-year-old, may be quite different to the immunity of a 70 or 80 or 90-year-old. My immunity may change. People will develop cancer, will go on to immunosuppressive drugs, may become HIV positive, whatever it is. Immunity is not a static thing. It will change in individuals, people's lives, as well as at a population level. And understanding that immunity, I think, at a global level is now critical to understanding where SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is going to go in the years ahead. So I do think that's critical. along with an understanding of the continued evolution of this virus.
Right. And so just to stay on this topic, I was wondering, your thoughts about long COVID, and then what kind of study should be done. There was like an article like few months ago saying that there's 1.3 million English people suffering from long COVID. How should we look at this, and how should we prevent long COVID if we can?
Yeah, I'm optimistic, I suppose, that actually vaccination will also be protective against long COVID. So that's, I hope, a very positive statement. Long COVID is very real. It is diverse. I don't think long COVID is a single thing. We have long COVID impacts on children, often after relatively mild infection. I think long COVID can affect, of course, the lungs and cause people to have continued shortness of breath or not being able to exercise properly. I suspect we will, in the coming weeks and months and years, learn that actually long COVID can affect many other parts of the system. We should remember that this infection is not just a respiratory infection. It affects many other organ systems within the body, the brain, the kidneys, the gastrointestinal system, probably affects all organs to some degree in some ways in different people. And I think understanding long COVID and also understanding the implications that's going to have for health systems going forward, because if long COVID proves to be a protracted condition over many years, then those people are going to require care. They're going to require medicine and public health thinking about their future lives and health, and that will have implications for the health system. So I think in understanding long COVID, how we can prevent it and hopefully how we might be able to treat it, I think is absolutely critical. And that's not just in this country, that is around the world. We should remember that this virus has now probably been into, I don't know, 3-4 billion people. There's a lot of people around the world infected. And if some of those, even a small percentage, have long COVID, then I think that's going to have profound implications on health systems for the long-term future. And just on terms of the humility, again, it's a scenario thinking and something I don't have, there's no evidence of it now. We don't know what being infected with COVID may or may not stimulate 5-10 years down the track. We don't know that wouldn't cause an increased incidence of an autoimmune condition or something else. I just think 2 years into a novel human infection, we absolutely need to have humility about the future path of infections, long COVID, future variants, immunity. We are still very early in this virus, with this virus.
Right. Yes, we're still early. And talking that we're still early, we have put a lot of our, I would say, hope in the vaccine that we have right now, but we see the limit of it. Some people now are saying, should we start to think about mucosal vaccines and what should be the use of it, or should be an adjunct or in replacement? I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Yeah,
this is something I feel very strongly about. The current vaccines we have, the mRNA or the adeno approaches, must be celebrated. They have been absolutely phenomenal in terms of safety, in terms of the speed of development, and also in their ability to protect you from getting ill, going to hospital and dying. So these vaccines have been absolutely staggering in every way. And the regulators who have approved them, I think, deserve enormous credit for the way that they handled that development. However, I don't think these vaccines are going to be the long-term solution to COVID-19. I think that we need to develop the science that would allow us, I hope, to have vaccines which are blocking transmission in the way that measles vaccines blocks transmission, so that we can reduce the amount of virus circulating around the world. We don't have that immunity to coronaviruses generally, so this is a long shot. It's what I call third generation vaccines, which would be easier to administer, cheaper, being able to be manufactured around the world, would give sterilizing immunity, in other words, block transmission and protect us against illness, and long lasting, so that we weren't having to have a vaccine every 6 to 12 months. That is the goal. I don't know if it's possible. It's not possible today, but I think that should be the goal. And I think that's what we should, as well as focusing on the here and now and what we need to do now for this emergency, but then also invest for now in that moonshot. At some point this decade, we get that sort of intervention, because I think that's going to be critical to reducing transmission, reducing future variants, and stop this being a haunting experience on a intermittent basis.
Right, and there's a question that has been keep coming back about immunocompromised people, because as we start to have to accept to live with this virus, is what is the uptick for an immunocompromised person to fare in this kind of environment of living with a virus? Any thoughts about that, and comforting thoughts for them?
Yeah, a huge question, because, and of course, not everybody with an immunocompromised position is the same. There's people with very severe immunocompromised situations. There's people who are immunocompetent today, but will become immunocompromised tomorrow. We don't know what will happen to their protection, having been protected today, what will happen in the future. And then, of course, around the world, we have lots of people who are on immunosuppressive drugs for cancer, or who are HIV positive, or have other reasons for being immunocompromised. And these people are in an extraordinarily difficult position now. Do they shield forever? Has the vaccine worked for them? I think the fear that they have, and these are very significant number of people in this country and, of course, around the world. And the other concern, of course, is that in immunocompromised people who may get chronically infected and not able to clear the virus, that the virus may continue to mutate and change within that chronic infection, and that may throw up the possibility of new variants. That's one possibility of where the Omicron variant arose from in the last quarter of 2021. What I would say is that tools are important here for people in those conditions. One is vaccination, and we must learn how often to vaccinate these individuals to give them protection. But the other is also other therapies which might be able to be used, which might be shorter term. I'm talking here about monoclonal antibodies or preventative treatment that would prevent people getting infected, as well as vaccination. So it may well be, it isn't just a magic bullet of a vaccine, but it's a vaccination plus monoclonal antibodies or other therapies which prevent people getting infected, or the infection getting established if they were to get infected. That is also, I think, high on the research agenda, because we owe a responsibility, quite rightly, to people who are immunocompromised, in order to provide a safe environment for them.
Right. Thank you about that. There's a lot of people in the chat, are asking about how much should we be empathic to people who desire to not be vaccinated. Like right now in Canada, we have truckers who's been basically occupying our capital for the last few days, moving to other capitals. And there's a lot of, I would say, anger and I would say impatient about the push for vaccinate everybody. So how much should be empathic, especially, when the immunocompromised are basically locked down in their home because they're afraid of catching it? What would be your words to convince them? And should we try to convince them, or just as well, like the virus, learn to live with people who will not be vaccinated?
Yeah, really difficult. So it's sort of instinctive response, really. I think public health works best through persuasion and trust rather than coercion. I think that people who are not yet being vaccinated in countries with access to vaccines, I don't think they're a single group of people. I think there are some people who, for whatever reason, are totally opposed to vaccination and can never be persuaded. I think there's personally, I think larger group who are cautious, who are perhaps more vaccine hesitant. They're not yet sure that the vaccine is the right thing for them. I think those individuals and communities are much more able to be persuaded with the evidence and with the information when it is available to them. I'm not so confident that we would be able to persuade the people that are vehemently against vaccination for other reasons. But I do think that is a relatively small group. And I would prefer public health to be done through trust and persuasion rather than coercion. And I think I would argue on the optimistic side, Joanne, that if you'd said to me 3 years ago that we would not have a vaccine, that we would develop a vaccine in 1 year or so, and that vaccine would be manufactured within this year, 25 billion doses of it, and the vast majority of people around the world would be willing to have 2 and then 3 doses when they had access to it, that would be a staggering achievement, I think. I think we need to work hard on people persuasion of the vaccine hesitant group, and we must engage with the people that are anti-vaccine, but I'm less confident we'll be able to persuade those.
Right. I think I share your thoughts on this. Tell us, because when you stepped down from the stage, you said that you wanted to go and refocus on basically the mission of Wellcome Trust. And you just said that we want to support international research effort to end this pandemic. What is Wellcome Trust focusing today on, and what do you hope to achieve over the next few years?
Yeah, it is really that I suppose longer term thinking. I think there are much better agencies than us in terms of whether UNICEFs or the MSFs of this world, the Gavis, the global funds, at getting the tools we currently have available to people, WHO, etc. I think our role is more to think what is coming next, what needs to be done now that would create those second and third generation drugs, diagnostic testing, vaccines, better PPE, access to oxygen, understanding the immunity so that we can then plan for the future, improving the mathematical modeling around pandemics generally. I think that's where we can play a better role, whether that is through the Global Fund, whether that is through Gavi or CEPI, or it is in bilateral arrangements with diagnostic testing. An area that I feel passionate about, which I think is neglected and something of a Cinderella, is around personal protective equipment. I don't think we've really made much progress in understanding personal protective equipment, what works, material science and things. I think that is an area that tends to get neglected. And then the last area I'd mention is around a critical area that is also come late to the table, understanding behavior, understanding social, for want of a better phrase, social sciences. And how does behavior in social sciences drive trust? How does it drive behavior change? How can that be used constructively in addition to vaccines, therapeutics, testing, PPE, that would allow us to reduce the impact of COVID-19 and better prepare for any future threats? Right.
Thank you very much for this. We have 7 more minutes to this, 6 minutes. And there's a question from one of our listeners. Say, you talk about the failure of diplomacy and the geopolitics that has blocked ensuring vaccine equity in dealing with COVID as a global problem. Looking to the future, do you have any hope? And if so, where do you see the opportunities for doing things differently and unblocking the political trends that we have seen?
I do have hope. You've got to have hope. I come from a generation whose parents lived through the 20th century, and a father who was a prisoner of war for 5.5 years. You've got to have hope. But I think what we must appreciate is when you go through a crisis, whether it's COVID-19, other similar crises, or of course, war and other things, it's only really often in that crisis or during it and in the transition that there is a consensus that we need to change, because there is so much understandable and positive conservatism around the systems. They're difficult to change. A crisis is a time when people need to ask, are we right? Are what we're doing, are our structures right? And if not, how could we reform them to be better? And in a world today where, frankly, borders are of marginal interest to a virus, no interest to a virus, where things happen at the speed they've happened, we should remind ourselves that Omicron first described on the 24th of November. had become the dominant strain in the UK within 2.5 weeks, and around the world within a month. That is a phenomenal pace. And we don't have the systems and structures to both invest for the long term to prevent those things happening, work across borders, and come together as a global community to ensure this never happens again. And I think those structures that were largely established after the end of the Second World War, from the United Nations to the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, it's not that we need to throw them out. It's just that we need them to focus on the sorts of challenges which are different in the 21st century. They're transnational. Science has got a role to play in preventing and mitigating their impacts, but so has global diplomacy and global politics. And I worry at the moment with the fragmentation, the polarization, the blame games that go on. It'll be very, very difficult to bring the world back together again, but I think absolutely critical if we're going to prevent pandemics, if we're going to address climate change, drug resistance, migration, energy, water, whatever it is, we need the world to work together. And at the moment, it's pretty fragmented.
Yeah, we all agree that we need to work differently and we need to somehow reset. So some people call you a global health reformer, Jeremy. So what are you going to do over your last few months in Wellcome Trust to make this happen? How concretely will you contribute to that? Because it's one thing to talk about it. These are good words and nice words, but how does it translate in tangible action?
Yeah, and that's the key. It's why easy words and warm words. Reform always sounds nice until somebody tries to do it. And yes, there are vested interests, and there are, we're in an era of, let's face it, east-west growing tension and increasingly north-south growing tension. We're in an era where there is clearly an emerging power. And, look back in history, when powers change, tectonic plates change, it's a time of extreme tension. I think we've got to take that tension out of the system. It's not just a few months away. I've got a little bit longer than that. But I do think that we need to try to come together, not just to speak in the abstract, not just to speak in the warm words, but to say, what does this actually mean? What does it? Yes, I'm not part of G7 or G20, although I contributed to the high-level plan, as you did, to the committee chaired by Helen Clark and Sharif, and I think these are important documents, and they're not perfect, but they do form the basis of change, and we need to bring those together now. We shouldn't give, I think, the political world the fragmentation of 100 different ideas. The ideas are on the table. We could bring those together now and actually frame an options for the future of the way the UN system may work. Reforms at the World Bank so that it can act both bilaterally and also at the global commons level where that's necessary. The willingness of the IMF to see these sorts of crises as actually a destabilizing event beyond health. We can make sure that health ministries and finance ministries and presidents and prime ministers are more tuned in, because this is not just a health issue. This is a whole of society issue. But how to do that? If I had the answer to that, I would have done it. I'm just I'm a doctor. I'm not a politician. I'm not a diplomat. I struggle with how to change where we are with the powers that be. And maybe that's my next, maybe that's what I need to go on and think about, but it is about implementing a reform rather than talking about it.
Okay, thank you very much. So no, he's not leaving in a few months. I guess it's in a few years. I don't know exactly, but I know that somehow his second term is going to come to an end. So I don't know, when is it, Jeremy? Can you tell us?
No, it's a secret.
Oh, it's a secret. So
no, my second term comes to an end in October 2023. That's publicly, of course, publicly known.
So you have time to be re-invited at a conversation at the Royal College of Medicine. So we'd like to thank everybody to join us. And then last question, when will we start to play cricket again on a regular basis, Jeremy?
Yeah, I know how much you love cricket, Joanne. So I don't play during the Northern Hemisphere winter, but I do play, and that starts in about April, May time this year. And we will be playing this year, absolutely. And I very much look forward to that. It's one of the highlights of the year. It's difficult to explain, Joanne, but when you get your cricket kit out from the basement, it's a bit like, I suppose, getting ice hockey stuff out whenever you do that. It's a real change. It's a real, the sun starts to come out and you feel better about the world. And I'm very pleased that I can still play cricket at my old age in April of this year. Yeah.
Right.
And yes, I do have time to reverse the tables on this, and I look forward to being invited to interview you with much. I'll look forward to that.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And it was a pleasure to be together and interview you. Thank you, everybody, to listen to us. And then, I wish you a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.